Burns, who is an affiliate full professor at Antioch University and the director of training at Los Angeles Gender Center. He is the co-editor of Cases in Multicultural Clinical Supervision, Models, Lenses, and Applications, and an associate editor for Training and Education in Professional Psychology. His professional interests include clinical supervision, feminist and womanist psychologies, social justice pedagogy, and sexual liberation. He also enjoys swimming, laps, jazz music, iced coffee, and taking naps. Next, we have Dr. Rufus Gonzalez, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and clinical assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago in Counseling Psychology program. He provides clinical supervision to master's and doctoral level counseling students, as well as supervision to doctoral students. He teaches counseling skills, professional issues, human development, and clinical supervision, and conducts research on microaggressions in supervision. Additionally, he is the former president of the Association of Chicagoland Externship and Practicum Training, and is a member of the executive committee. Previously, he served as Assistant Director of Clinical Training at DePaul University Counseling Services in Chicago, Illinois. And finally, we have Dr. Aparna Inman, Chairperson of the Department of Education and Human Services and Professor in Counseling Psychology at Lehigh University, is a supervisor, trainer, and scholar with research interests in multicultural competencies in social justice and supervision and training, international and immigrant psychology. She recently co-hosted and developed the first APA DVD series on supervision models. She has also presented at various conferences and conducts clinical supervision workshops nationally and internationally. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, a Fulbright Scholar, and a recipient of the Excellence in Supervision Research Award from the Society of Counseling Psychology section on supervision and training. Additionally, I'd like to also introduce the Early Career Psychology Committee on the section on supervision and training. So Heidi Hutman is the chair, and then myself, Krishna Carey, and Cecile Bang have been the creators of this webinar. If you would like to access the recording after tonight, you can go to clinicalsupervisor.org to learn more about that. Let me see here if there's anything else I forgot. We really want this webinar to be supportive for early career counselors and psychologists, especially those who may be new to the supervisory role and working with diverse supervisees and their clients. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to the panelists. We're going to spend about 35 to 40 minutes on about 4 different questions. The first question is, what does multiculturally competent supervision look like? What things do multiculturally competent supervisors do and not do? And I'm just going to open it up to all 3 of you and whoever wants to chime in.
All right, I will chime in. Hi, folks. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this panel. It's wonderful to talk about supervision. I know all 3 of us feel very passionately about it. What does a multicultural competent supervision look like, and what do multiculturally competent supervisors do and not do? So I'd like to focus more on doing rather than not doing. And essentially, it's really kind of those supervisors are multiculturally competent when they're sensitive to cultural dynamics and the relationship with their supervisees, and also when they kind of look at the relationship between supervisees and their clients. It's really important to go in with the notion that all relationships are cross-cultural, regardless of who's in front of you. It's in the relationship, it's helpful when a supervisor is culturally humble, in that they recognize their limitations. They are able to engage in discussions and perhaps some difficult dialogues, and are able to pick up opportunities when cultural issues play out. They focus on their own professional development. And most importantly, I think it's not a matter of having a toolkit, but rather philosophy or attitude or value of being culturally focused. It's not just something you do because someone is in front of you, and that's really important in terms of the philosophy.
Thank you. I really appreciate the reminder that it's not a checkbox. You know, it's not something, these tools that we just acquire, but really it's a way of life as a counselor. It's a way of being for us.
I also, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was thinking about these questions is that you also have to have a foundation of just having good supervision. You have to be a good supervisor at a basic level. And I think when you're looking at cross-cultural supervision or diversity in supervision, I think if you don't have that basic foundation, then that amplifies the miscommunications or the misunderstandings that can happen. I was thinking of a concrete example of sort of making sure that the way the relationship, the expectations that you as a supervisor have for the relationship are explicit and laid out at the beginning, and also being able to talk with your supervisee about what kinds of things that will be collaborative within the relationship, that will sort of come from their perspective about how the structure works versus what you need as a supervisor versus the site or the training agency that you're working with, what they need for the structure of the supervision. I was thinking of an example where if you don't have a process for how to handle when one of the two of you in the supervision dyad needs to miss or reschedule a supervision experience, then that can create a lot of miscommunications and misunderstanding if it's not talked about ahead of time. And that gets exemplified or gets exaggerated if the supervisee is expecting you to tell them when to reschedule, or if you're waiting for the supervisee to approach you about how to reschedule, something like that. So when you're looking at sort of where the responsibility for the relationship lies, and there's a difference there because of the cultural understandings or backgrounds of the supervisor and the supervisee, it's really important to have those conversations at the beginning, I think.
I'll echo what my colleagues have already said. I think the one thing that also comes to mind is just the knowledge that where we are in our knowledge base within not only counseling psych, but also health service psychology generally, really speaks to an idea that for some of us, we may never get to a place of cultural competence, that we are ongoing all the time, and that we may never get to a place where we're really competent to work with certain groups of people that might be different than we are. And so the cultural humility model that's come out in the last 4 to 5 years, I think, is a really great framework that many supervisors use to really look at the idea of sitting down with a supervisee, kind of knowing or assessing where they are, not just within their own kind of cultural knowledge about self, but also with respect to others, as well as different kind of interactional or interpersonal processes. And that might look different depending on different dimensions of culture or different identity or facets of culture. And so really being able to understand that specifically. And then as my colleagues also noted, that I think that it's not necessarily a toolbox, it is a philosophy. But that with that can come also a variety of different kind of strands within the evidence base to look at how we actually not only attend to culture within our supervisee as a growing, developing healer, but also how they understand clients' different intersecting identities as well. And that all the different ways, especially right now, given our current kind of socio-political climate, that might actually impact mental well-being. So that's what I'll add to that question.
Thank you. I appreciate all your thoughts. So now we're kind of reflecting even on the question which we posed in and of itself. It seems contraindicative of how you think about multiculturalism, and that because we asked multicultural competence, right? But it sounds like you're coming from the framework of humility and humbleness and a philosophy. So how do you tend to respond when someone says, I want to be more competent then in multiculturalism?
Well, I was going to say, I think having a conversation similar to the one that Theo just said, discussed. You talk about or I would talk about my own experience and my own struggles as a trainee and now as a supervisor and somebody who's been in the field for many years. I think making it having an explicit conversation about how looking at of cultural humility and cultural assumptions and cultural understandings are going to be a part of the relationship, both with regard to the dyad between the supervisee and myself, but also in trying to understand how we understand the clients that they're serving differently because of our own backgrounds and our own experiences. So I think framing it in the idea of it being a journey where we're working together towards a better understanding of ourselves and a better understanding of how our own experiences shape the way we understand the experiences of the people that we're serving and working with. And I also think, it's helpful to make it part of structurally part of the supervision, and to say that this is something that I value and that I'm, as your supervisor, trying to help you to value, because it's part of the identity and role that we have as counseling psychologists in this profession, and making sure that, when we do have conversations about learning goals and outcomes, that's a part of it too.
I get a little nervous when I hear the word competence or competent, because there's an assumption in some ways that you have to do X, Y, and Z and you'll reach that point. And I think to Theo's point earlier, it's an evolving process. It's something that we learn. It's similar to kind of the identity awareness models, that you learn something and, and then you might have experiences and you kind of, again, have to shift your center, so to speak, depending on what happens. And you might know something and then realize you don't know as much as you thought you did. And so I think that's why it's really important to be humble. It's really important to kind of recognize that we're getting there, but it's always an evolving process.
Thank you. I just want to take a second to remind those who are in attendance that you can submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen or via the chat function, and then we'll address the questions at the end of the panelist discussion. So the next question that we wanted to talk about was, how do supervisors build supportive relationships with diverse supervisees? How is power addressed and navigated?
Anyone want to go first?
Yeah, since Arpana opened up first, why don't we have Theo or Rufus go this time?
Sure, I can go first. I guess I think it's important, again, like I said, to make it sort of a structural component of the relationship, and to have explicit conversations from the beginning about not only the power dynamics that are there because of the evaluation and because of the role that you have as the supervisor, but it's your responsibility to also address the social identities and the social experiences and roles that are also playing into the power dynamics between you and your supervisee, and then also, again, with the supervisor or with the trainee and their clients. So I think it's important to really, for me anyway, it's important to really form a relationship with the supervisee that is built on a mutual respect, and that in some ways acknowledges the power differentials, but also tries to minimize them, so that it can be a place where we're both vulnerable and where we're both able to sort of take chances in the learning that we will both be doing through the process. So I think it's important to let the trainee decide how to lead the relationship in many ways. I think it's important to get to know the trainee personally and to understand who they are, and not just their work clinically or their work professionally, but to understand them as a person. And I think it's important both ways for that to happen. But that you have to remember that as the supervisor, there's an awful lot of authority and power there. And if you're not aware of how the student is interpreting that, then that can really put them in an uncomfortable or an awkward situation. And so to let them decide how personal or how boundaried they want the relationship to be as you're going along. I think the other thing that is important that I try to remember is that as the trainer or as the supervisor, we have a role in the structural system in a way that they do not. And so part of the supervision is in the context of the training environment. And so as a supervisor, I'm trying to advocate not only for the relationship that I have with the student, but for all of the students in the training environment, and to try and set up a system that allows them to have a voice, allows them to feel like that they're safe in the environment, and that their opinions matter, and that it's a place where they can learn and be challenged. And I think that's not just about the dyad between the supervisor and the supervisee. I think that's also about how the supervisor can help shape and change the policies at the site, how they can advocate for, even if you're not the training director where you're a supervisor, you can still advocate for the training class and for supervisees, and have a mentality of trying to understand how their experience is being played out in that system, and how that is all culturally there's a cultural context to all of that for the students.
So really being culturally mindful as a supervisor extends beyond the room at an individual level, but really goes into the greater context of the training program.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
Theo or Aparna, do you have anything to add?
I want to highlight something that Rufus said earlier. When I engage in supervision, one of the things I use a lot is self-disclosure. I see self-disclosure, especially coming from a supervisor perspective, is really important in kind of navigating that power in the relationship. It's really important to acknowledge that supervisors do have power by virtue of the fact that we evaluate our supervisees, but the way to manage that power is to be vulnerable, is to be able to share our clinical, cultural mistakes. Because research is very clear in terms of the fact that when supervisors disclose early on, supervisors are likely to trust that relationship, are likely to disclose more versus engage in more non-disclosures if they don't feel comfortable. So sharing aspects of yourself early on, role modeling as well in terms of what we share about our own cultural aspects and boundaries, certainly in relationships in the supervision, is important to maintain. But I think sharing your vulnerabilities in the service of the client and the clinical work with the supervisee is really important.
Yeah, I'll echo some of that. I guess the thing that I would add is I think power actually kind of hides or permeates in multiple levels of context. And so Falikoff's model from 2014 speaks a little bit about the different kind of dimensions where supervisees can be really disempowered, and speaks about kind of intrapersonal power as well as different levels of power. So also just assessing where supervisees may have felt disempowered within mental health like industries previous to your work with them, and being able to really kind of, as both my colleagues have mentioned, kind of co-construct with supervisees how they want to create levels of power or what that might look like. And obviously that looks different for different people, and that different kind of training experiences may have left supervisees previous to their work with us really disempowered. So being able to kind of co-construct that. And then what we've actually learned recently is that one of the competencies that is often not brought into graduate training is this idea of feeling disempowered related to self-care. And so being able in some ways to think about intrapersonal power as how individuals build resilience as new clinicians, how they take on all of that stress related to working with difficult clients, because many times the trainees with the least amount of training are the ones that are often seeing folks with the highest levels of pathology, and there's a high correlation there. And so being able to really help trainees to understand and articulate how they build some of that as part of the empowerment process. But I really want to echo what both Drs. Inman and Gonzalez have said around being able to really understand the ways in which power is inevitable in the relationship, and so not addressing it can recapitulate it and do a lot of harm.
Do you have examples of how you've brought this up with supervisees, how you've brought up the power differential, or this idea of building on mutual respect and taking chances? Like, what does that look like as a supervisor?
I can start if folks want me to. Is that okay? Okay. I use Laura Brown's work. Her recent second edition of her feminist therapy text has, it's a quadrant model of looking at different kind of levels of personal depower and empowerment. And so actually just copying that model and bringing it in during initial supervision sessions and saying, which of these quadrants resonates for you? What does that look like? The other way that I bring it in is in learning style. I'm aware from just reading that a lot of supervision is auditory, and some supervisees are not auditory learners. And so case consultation then for individuals that are visual or experiential learners may not necessarily be the way that they learn best. And so even acknowledging the different diverse learning styles that trainees bring in, especially for folks that are not educated within traditional educational institutions. And so even just having those initial conversations. So my short answer to your question is, I think it's a conversation that happens as part of the building of the relationship, but there can be kind of theoretical models that provide validation for why you're bringing it in and provide some ability for trainees to actually feel a little bit more able to be vulnerable because they see it on a piece of paper. It's not just coming out of my mouth. And so they recognize that it's important for them to bring in.
Thank you.
I often talk about my own experiences from when I was a trainee and how I had some experiences that were really very positive with supervisors. Who I felt like really understood my identity and my experience in the world and how that shaped my work with the clients that I was learning to do therapy with. And then I had other supervisors who really weren't aware of how their interactions were affecting my performance as a student and as a therapist. And so I bring that up as a way to tell students that I don't want to be the latter type of supervisor. And so I share with them some of my own struggles, specific stories and incidences. And then, as Dr. Burns was saying, I think it's really important to find out what they're coming in with and what their previous training experiences and supervision experiences were like, because I think that sort of gives you a baseline for what their worries, fears, and hopes with you as a culturally competent supervisor are gonna what they're gonna project onto you. And so I think having sort of those two foci for the beginning of the supervisory relationship. Actually, when you're first starting out, they don't often have a lot of clients that they're working with, and so there's more time to attend to that sort of process of understanding one another and assumptions. And so I think that's part of what I do.
Rapana, did you want to add anything?
No, I think both my colleagues have articulated a lot of things I was thinking about, so I'm just going to hold off.
Okay. So we'll move on to the next question. How can supervisors work through conflict with cultural humility and responsiveness? And Theo, do you want to start with this one?
Sure, because I've never ever had any type of conflict with any supervisee. So obviously the word that rings most relevant and salient for me in your question is cultural kind of humility and responsiveness. So I think part of it is the supervisor who has some self-awareness about the different kind of roles and attitudes that they might bring into such a conflict. And I think that there is a way in which being able to kind of self-disclose when we've made mistakes and being able to really acknowledge those mistakes, I think that doesn't do everything, but I think it's a good first step. And I think that that is part of the way that those interactions can lead to either a reparation or some sort of understanding. And then I think the other thing is to be open to the idea that conflict happens in any relationship, and that supervision is no different. And that conflict can come from lots of different places. It can come from some sort of dynamic between the supervisor and supervisee. It can be in part from parallel process that a supervisee might be experiencing with a client. And it could also be as a result of a variety of different factors that are impacting the relationship at different levels. And so I think that for me, what comes most clearly is being aware of that and acknowledging those different kinds of domains and the impact. I think that for me begins a big piece. And I think if, as my colleagues have been saying earlier, that if the relationship is set up right in the beginning, then it's easier when those kinds of conflicts arise to really fall back on some of the values that you set in terms of the relationship in supervision that you want to have that happen. I guess the other side of the answer that I'll give is I often find that it also happens in group supervision modalities as well, and that there may not only be kind of conflict that happens between supervisor and supervisee, but between supervisees that a supervisor might actually witness. And so being able as well to fall back on different types of values or norms that the group has set, and then being able to really model appropriate conflict resolution, I think is critical. And can be a real learning experience for all of the supervisees that are in that group.
So and I guess my wondering in that situation where you might see one supervisee is more culturally aware than others, and it creates conflict in that group, or is more advanced multiculturally, and they're kind of pulling their other supervisees along, their co-interns along. Have you witnessed conflict around that? If that makes sense.
It does. Really quick, do other folks want to answer that, or do you want me to? Yeah, okay. I think one of the things that happens with those kinds of differing levels is making sure, again, that in the beginning of that type of group is to kind of set norms related to how we all want to learn, and that even though we may be in different spaces in certain domains, we may be in different places in other domains, and that we're all kind of learning. And how do we foster a mutual environment where even though I may know something that somebody else does, how do I take that as an opportunity to help recognize that we're all moving at different spaces, and that there may even be something that we're learning from that interaction that we may not necessarily know that we're learning, because we're so focused on the thing that we do know that we don't focus on the thing that we don't know. And so really just looking at different opportunities for growth, which sometimes when you really know an answer, you have lots of really big feelings about a certain interaction. It's hard to kind of stop. And I know in my own work, it's been hard for me at moments to go, wait a second, what am I learning from this situation? Because I'm really focused on the thing that I know. But in the moments where I've been able to do that and remind myself, it's actually been a pivotal learning experience, in a variety of different reasons. So that's my thought about that. Thank you.
So essentially even being humble within the humbleness.
Yeah, exactly.
Rufus or Aparna, do you have any thoughts on the original question about how to work through conflict and humility and responsiveness?
Yeah, as Theo's mentioned, conflicts are a natural part of any relationship. Oftentimes, I think the process sometimes is more important than the outcome, and how we engage in and discuss those conflicts. And it's really not about one's ego. And I know as supervisors, we might feel challenged in some ways because we are being challenged in our knowledge. But it's really a relational process, and the relationship between a supervisor supervisee is very different from that of a client and a supervisee or a therapist. And really, we had two colleagues discussing issues that come up in the supervision process, and so to recognize that there are multiple perspectives, that each brings a certain level of expertise into the process, and to be able to see some of those kind of nuances and not think of yourself as someone just because you've been a supervisor doesn't mean you know it all, kind of a thing. But the other piece is also sometimes you're able to work through the conflict, sometimes ruptures happen. And then how do you kind of address those ruptures? And sometimes it's feasible, sometimes it's not. And does that mean then that maybe there's a conversation to have? The supervisor maybe needs to consult, get their own supervision as well. I know in the United States, we don't really ask our supervisors to get supervision once they've graduated, which is a problem. We all need guidance, we all need supervision, we all need consultation. And so I think recognizing some of those pieces will go a long way in the process.
And I guess that I kind of wonder, what happens when the rupture is not on your end, but on the supervisee's end. Maybe they've said something to you that has been discriminative against your own identity, or was hurtful towards you, and that was the rupture. How have you been able to address that when discrimination has happened within supervision against you? And for anybody who wants to jump in on that.
I think I see this relationship as a tango. Each person plays a part. It's not just one person kind of doing it, so to speak. And so you really need to kind of look at the rhythm of what's been going on and why the ruptures happen and try and understand it. Because you can certainly react to the situation feeling upset or hurt, and that's where the supervision and consultation really helps, because you can get away from the place and kind of think through with someone else what might have been going on, that sometimes we have blind spots and we don't see certain things. So I hear what you're saying in terms of perhaps there might be microaggressions and things like that, but again, I think it's important to kind of see what's going on. Maybe I've done something as well in that relationship that has kind of created some issues or assumptions in our relationship, and I think we need to address that.
We have a couple more minutes of time for this particular question, if there are other thoughts on it, or no, we haven't heard from Rufus yet.
Yeah, I did have just sort of, I guess, one thought, maybe two thoughts. With regard to the conflict and managing it with cultural humility and responsiveness, but also I think a sense of responsibility as the supervisor. As Theo mentioned, conflicts are going to happen, and I think priming the supervisee for that and having, again, a preemptive conversation about how can we handle this? What do you think might be helpful for the two of us in this relationship if either of us are feeling like we've been hurt or offended or misunderstood by the other person? And so even, the supervisee may not have the ability to tell you what they would need at the beginning of the relationship, or may not have the comfort level at the beginning of the relationship. But the fact that you're bringing it up at the beginning of the relationship, I think, is really major and important. And then to go along with that, to structure ways in which you get feedback from the student regularly, even both formally and informally, about these kinds of issues, to check in and say, how are we doing with, not just with our relationship, but with how we understand one another, so that it becomes part of the process that the two of you engage in through, over time in a regular way. So I think that's pretty important. I had another thought too. I I can't remember. If it comes back to me, I'll say.
I will add to or validate the idea of setting up how we deal with conflict at the very beginning. Just as me as a supervisee, our training director did at the very beginning as co-interns, we created a how do we deal with conflict individually and how do we want to deal with conflict as a cohort? How do we want to engage with each other when we have issues? And I think that did really set a nice tone for us for the rest of the year, and allowed us to get to know each other and our own cultural and values around conflict and confrontation. So, you remember?
I did remember what I was going to say. I think one of the things that's also important is to, as the relationship progresses and you feel more comfortable with one another and feel more connected to each other, again, as the supervisor, to not get too comfortable in that relationship and start to take it for granted, because you may start to say things or interact with them in a way that they're not comfortable with or that they don't understand. So you still, I'm not saying that you need to keep your guard up, but you still have to maintain an understanding of the power differential that you hold. And in particular, one of the things that that I think sometimes people forget is even when you hold similar identities to the other person, because of the power structure that's in place, that those similar identities may not be exactly the same, or their experiences may not be the same, but in the context of the evaluation and the hierarchy structure of supervision, you can't assume that the person is going to respond or understand in a way that someone in a social relationship outside of supervision would respond, or someone in your work environment who isn't at a different hierarchical level than you is going to respond. And so I think it's important to remember that even if even if there's the perception that you hold similar identities, that doesn't mean your experience and understanding of things are going to be the same.
So really being mindful of being curious, even when we perceive ourselves as being similar in identities, continuing to be curious about their story and who they are.
Yep.
I just want to offer, before we go on to our final question, I want to remind attendees that you can ask questions via the Q&A or the chat buttons, and we'll address those questions toward the end. So our final question: what are some important considerations when providing evaluations and feedback to diverse supervisees? I'll leave it open. We can circle back to our PANA, whatever works.
Sure. So I think this is something that Rufus already said in terms of expectations and feedback that he kind of talked about. Feedback, so certainly having very clear expectations right from the start in terms of how people like to receive feedback, how supervisees like to receive feedback, how conversation should occur in the supervision session, what is the evaluation process, how do you engage in difficult dialogues, and what are some challenging points perhaps for supervisees that supervisors need to know so that they can be attuned to some of those things related to transference, counter-transferential issues. Feedback should be formative and summative in terms of ongoing. There should be no surprises with evaluations or feedbacks, feedback processes. That's really important. And I know sometimes, and when I teach the supervision course, I'm always talking to my supervisors in training that when they put numbers, that the qualitative piece should be very connected to the numbers they put, and the qualitative feedback should be behavioral and very tangible. So you need to be able to give clear examples for why you've evaluated someone in a certain way. So it needs to be transparent and very explicit. So I'm just going to kind of stop there.
Thank you. Theo or Rufus?
Are you okay if I go? Yeah. Awesome. So yeah, I think the only other things that I really want to highlight and also add are that obviously for me, evaluation should be really connected to goals that are set in the beginning of the process, and that if there are kind of specific goals for trainees to reach, kind of humility with certain kind of cultural communities of clients or in different kind of domains of their work, I think that can be really helpful. And that, given that individuals are really wanting to learn specific information about the different ways that they're doing work in with diverse clients, thinking about not just supervision of kind of, let's say, individual or group psychotherapy, but also things like advocacy and outreach, and really finding ways to ensure that we can evaluate the different ways that folks are working on different ecological contexts. I think we're really at a place as a discipline where we're great at thinking about the ways that we measure culture and traditional kind of psychotherapeutic settings, but we still need to kind of really think creatively and outside the box about the ways that we think about evaluating outreach and consultation and things of that nature. So, and then obviously, I think that Dr. Inman's point related to highlighting the connection between qualitative and quantitative components is really pivotal, and that really kind of emphasizing and maybe even structuring an evaluation tool before to kind of let the supervisee know how they think about the difference between a 4 and a 5, for example, and what does that look like, and is there a baseline where trainees may actually need to start from? Or that maybe there's no way you'll ever get a 5, at a certain point, because maybe in your first practicum, that's not where you're supposed to be. And so being able to really structure that on the front end, I think can be helpful and allows supervisees to kind of know a little bit about the context behind the evaluation process.
Well, thank you. So essentially, it sounds like both you and Arpana are agreeing that, we need to have no surprises, be very clear. And then I'm also hearing from you that we need some creative ways of providing feedback, and also acknowledging the limits. Like, we're not, supervisees may not be 100%. And I imagine in this day and age, as perfectionism is on the rise, that can become more and more of a difficult conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we move on to questions from the audience?
I did have one sort of addition to the evaluation piece. I think part of the thing that's also really important is the way it's delivered to the student. And so we've talked about supervision being a place where the supervisor's humble throughout, and I think that also needs to happen when you're providing especially difficult feedback for students. So when I do have something difficult to tell a student, or feedback that's difficult, I do try to make sure that I give that feedback as I go along. But if I know it's going to come up in the discussion of a evaluation, I try to make sure that I come at it from this is what I'm seeing, or this is how I'm understanding it. Help me to understand it from your perspective and what it means to you. And this is why I think this is why I'm thinking that this is how the feedback occurs. So I think it's important to attend to the giving of feedback just as it is important to attend to the relationship as you're going along. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. One second, sorry. So for the audience, we actually have several questions that have come through. The first one is, what has been the hardest part of cultivating your cultural humility as a supervisor? And I'll leave that open for whoever wants to jump in.
I can start that. Are folks okay with that? I think one of the things that as a supervisor has taken me a while to kind of think through and work through is that traditionally when I took a supervision course and learned how to be a supervisor, we often talked about power kind of unidimensionally in terms of the supervisor having power and the trainee not having any, and that given the different identities that we held in the room, that looked very complex. And that, for example, working with individuals who may actually hold privilege in areas that I don't, or individuals who didn't have privilege that I did, that power looked very different depending on that supervisee, as we've talked about. And so I think one of the difficulties for me has been thinking about the ways that I own some of the privilege that I have in the room, and then also not necessarily making my owning the privilege in the room about me owning my privilege. And so thinking about the ways in which that is a conversation that obviously needs to be had, but that I also have to do my own work outside of supervision, just like I would with clients, so that the supervision space isn't necessarily always about holding my own work, that I need to do my work as a culturally humble supervisor outside of the room, and that when the different dimensions of power kind of look different depending on who's in the room with me, that's a real kind of unique opportunity to think about the ways that you have to do your own work outside of your professional sphere.
Thank you. Do others have any comments on that, on what's been the hardest part about cultivating your own cultural humility as a supervisor?
I was going to say, I think one of the things that I struggled with was, especially when I first started to provide supervision, was feeling like I needed to be an authority, like that I needed to have the right answer, that I needed to be culturally competent. When I was trained, the language and the terminology and the ideas we used were cultural competence. It wasn't cultural humility. And so that idea has sort of grown over time as I've grown as a supervisor too. And so I think sometimes I still feel the pressure, and it's a two-way street, because the student wants the pressure. They want the security of someone who is an expert and can tell them how to do something the right way and who has all of the answers. And sometimes I struggle with not falling into that same mindset, but really allowing myself to have the vulnerabilities and the space to be wrong, and to have to and to be able to admit when I do need to do my own work outside of supervision, or when I have made a mistake, or when I've offended a student. So, cultural humility and being vulnerable it's a hard process to go through. I mean, you really have to face your own experience, and that can be painful, just like therapy.
Yeah, I was just going to add that. It's just like therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. Just to add a little bit more to that, I recall when I initially started, I was in the doctoral program learning how to be a supervisor. And I think the idea of being a trainee, providing supervision to another student, creates some interesting dynamics in addition to some of the other identities. So I think that certainly kind of creates some challenges in terms of feeling that you have to know everything, or you have to appear competent, even though you are still in training, but you can't really, you have to navigate the role of a trainee, supervisor and trainee, while supervising someone. And so you need to really show some level of competence and ability to manage. And I think for those of you who are perhaps in those situations, that it's a normal process, because we want to appear as competent as we can, because we want to make that relationship comfortable, and not be seen as incompetent, even though we might be humble in our process. And again, that goes back to really seeking supports and supervision from your cohort and your other colleagues.
Well, I think that segues into, there was a question on here that I wanted to find. But I think, so there was a question from a person that says, I adopted the cultural humility model in supervision. However, one supervisee did not seem to appreciate it and seemed to view my humility as incompetence. How do you handle this kind of response? And I believe that it was Rufus who was talking about the struggle with competence. So if you wanted to, and acknowledging that, that might be good.
Sure. I think I think it really is about trying to understand what their expectations for supervision are, and sort of. So it sounds like in this particular case there was a mismatch, or maybe a miscommunication between the supervisor and the supervisee. But I usually try and err on the side when I'm first forming a relationship with a student to present how I think things should be. But like I said, I think I mentioned this earlier, or really let them sort of call the shots about how the relationship proceeds. And so there's probably something that supervisee really needed with regard to the expertness of a supervisor in order to feel comfortable enough to be able to do the job that they were being asked to do. And so I think it's up to the supervisor to sort of find a compromise that would work, either explicitly or implicitly with the supervisee. If the supervisee isn't able to hear the language or the words that you're using, and because of whatever they're struggling with developmentally or in their own history as a supervisee, then it's up to the supervisor to try and find a way to meet them where they can hear it and where they can get that feedback. So I probably would try and assess a little bit more about what the student understood the relationship to function of the relationship to be, try to provide them with that, but then also to try to provide them with the additional aspects of the relationship that I think are necessary and essential to becoming a multiculturally oriented therapist.
It just reminds me of being very collaborative with the supervisee and going back and forth and negotiating the understanding. Theo or Apana, do you have anything to add? Or I can go on to another question. Okay. So another question is, get to the part. In terms of embedding into the structure regarding multiculturalism from the beginning, can you provide specific examples about what conversations look like, about what to say, maybe decision points to make on what you would say based on the supervisors and supervisees' minority, majority identities? So providing specific examples on how you might address decision points based on the supervisees' minority, majority identities. And since Rufus answered the last one, I'll have Theo or Parna answer this one.
Dr. Raymond, do you want me to go first? Okay. So I think, obviously for me, what comes up is knowing that there's lots of different ways that I think that type of conversation can be instigated. And I think that there isn't necessarily the right way to say it, as much as that there are some kind of points that you're making sure, or talking points that come into the room. As you've probably already guessed, I use theoretical models a lot so that there is some kind of framework or validation. So again, I think thinking about like Hayes's addressing model. So Pamela Hayes in her book writes a lot about kind of addressing kind of cultural complexities, and uses the addressing model as a way to look at the ways that different identities intersect. And so I think the Hayes model is a great one. I think looking very specifically at Singh and Chun's model of supervision for queer people of color supervisors, that's also been really helpful in terms of thinking about the ways that privilege and oppression may impact not only the supervision process, but also the domain of knowledge and skill acquisition. So I guess for me, it's not necessarily what I say as much as how I provide a framework for saying it. And then the other side of that question is about individuals kind of knowing what to say to clients. And so I think part of that is kind of assessing what are fears about what they will say without your directive feedback will be inappropriate. And so it's not necessarily about telling them what to say, but giving them the confidence to feel as though what they can say or what they think they want to say might actually be a good idea. And so types of activities might even include things like role playing and things of that nature within the supervision context. So I think those would be my initial thoughts to that question.
Thank you. Arpana, do you have anything else to add?
So I also use theoretical models. I tend to be very systemic in my approach to thinking about things. And so often consistent with maybe the Holloway's supervision model, I talk a lot about kind of looking at systems within systems and needing to be aware of culture within the context of different systems. I also think the Bronfenbrenner's model is a good way for us to think a little bit about the impact that happens through the different processes and different levels of interaction. And so kind of, I think sometimes thinking about it theoretically allows us to go from an intellectual level to kind of starting to think about examples of what that would look like in day-to-day interactions. So it creates a sense of safety initially, at least as you start having the conversation. So once folks are comfortable with kind of an intellectual understanding, they can come to some of those other more personal levels of conversation.
Thank you. So another question is, how would you advise a supervisee who feels that they are being asked to adopt a therapeutic approach that is inconsistent with their own cultural background? So for example, if the body language and speech that a student uses, if a student uses to express compassion and warmth is inconsistent with your own expectations as a supervisor or seems to be detrimental to client rapport. So how would you advise a supervisee who feels that they are being asked to adopt a therapeutic approach that's inconsistent with their own cultural background? Arpana, since you're already unmuted, do you want to try for that one?
Sure. I think it's really important to think a little bit about, again, having conversations about what assumptions we bring into the relationship and how we are managing those kinds of assumptions, whether it's in the context of my relationship with my client or in the context of my relationship with my supervisor and the supervisee relationship. If something is inconsistent, I think there needs to be a conversation that has to happen with regard to where that inconsistency is. Where is the inconsistency being felt? Is it being felt from the supervisor end or the supervisee end? So I'd want to know a little bit more about those kinds of pieces. And I'm trying to look at the question that you asked, because it seemed like it tapped into a couple different questions, yes?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the main question was, how would you advise a supervisee who feels like they're who it's going against their therapeutic approach, or the therapeutic approach is inconsistent with their own cultural background? I think that's the main question. And then the person who had the question gave an example.
Right. So I think this again really goes back to kind of where the inconsistency is coming from and how to explore what the inconsistency is in the context of those relationships. Where is the push happening? What is preventing them from looking at the multiple perspectives in the context of the relationship? If this is, if the supervisor is projecting on in a very dominant perspective into the relationship, and the supervisor is being pushed in some ways, it is something that the supervisee, it can be challenging in some ways for the supervisee, more so because of the power differential. And part of this is perhaps going and consulting with another colleague, maybe within their setting, to kind of see how they might navigate some of those pieces. And this goes back to the issue of advocacy. And how can you create some kinds of allyship that can allow a shift in the process to occur in the relationship?
I guess,
Rufus, do you have any thoughts?
well, I was trying to think. I think part of the reason it was hard for me to formulate a response to this question is because I wasn't sure if I was answering it as the student's supervisor, or if I was answering it as an advocate that the student went to because they felt misunderstood by their supervisor. And so I think depending on, you know, between those two situations, there's different responses. I think I would try to be a support to the student in either way. I would try, and if I were the student supervisor and they felt like they could talk to me about this, that would be wonderful, actually. And I'd try to understand what sort of pressure I was putting, like you said, what kind of pressure I was putting on the student. But I think I'd probably come at it from the perspective of what can we do for the client, and what does the client need in this situation? You know, because I believe that as a therapist, my role is to help the client and adapt to what the client needs. And so if I'm aware that I'm providing something that's not being useful or helpful to the client, then I would try and shift what I'm doing as a way to make it a more successful therapeutic relationship. And so that's the focus that I would come from in working with the supervisee, while also trying to make sure that I understood the assumptions that I was holding about what it means to be, you know, a therapist in, you know, Western culture, and how I'm placing that on a student who may not feel comfortable with that. I'm not sure how I would respond if I was sort of an advocate for the student. I'd probably talk with the student, try and help them to feel understood, and help them develop a plan that they felt like would be useful for them in addressing the situation with their supervisor. And if they didn't feel comfortable in addressing the situation with the supervisor, I'd probably talk to the training director to figure out how they would want to handle the situation. And hopefully, I mentioned this right at the very beginning, hopefully they're in a training system that advocates for students and has a policy in place about how to handle a conflict between a supervisor and a supervisee that can't get resolved at the individual level. And if that's the case, then I'd try and advocate for the student through that way.
Theo, you want to add anything?
No, I think that for me, that feels pretty comprehensive. Yeah.
It looks like Kate's computer lost power, and so she sent an email to us as the panelists and asked that we sort of, as time is up, end the panel.
Okay.
So, well, thank you all. I really appreciated having the opportunity to talk with you know, the other panelists, and also talk with the attendees. So I really appreciate it, and I wish you all the best in your journey on your development as multiculturally oriented supervisors. And please feel, I think my contact information is somewhere. Please feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk further. I would appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, again, I'll echo that. And just, I know that the section on supervision and training is offering a variety of really cool programming. So this will be the first of many, I think I'm correct in assuming. So stay tuned for more exciting pieces. And yeah, my contact is there, and I'm happy to be a resource if that's needed for folks.
Yeah, I want to echo the thanks, and thank you for bringing up some great questions. It's really got us thinking about a lot of things, and you know, we're learning from this process as well. So thank you for stimulating our senses as well in different ways. So thank you.